I am John Cullen. Welcome to another episode of Hypothetically Speaking. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look, a deeper dive, at some of the video that we had been watching earlier in the week that came out of the Congressional investigation into the source of the coronavirus. And there was some testimony, I think it lasted 3 or 4 hours. And we're going to spend some time looking at some of the highlights of that testimony a little bit more closely and see what we can take away from this Senate testimony. So first, I'm going to play some of this video clip for you. This is a video that I published in April of 2020, so about 15 months ago. And the reason I'm playing you the video is that the topic is going to come up in the Congressional discussion 15 months after I published this video. So let's watch this together. We're going to get into some of this testimony, break it down, and let's see what you guys think. Thanks for joining Hypothetically Speaking. I'm John Cullen. Let's get started.
Not only the ranking member on the Committee on Foreign Affairs, but also the head of the House's China Task Force, Chairman Mike McCall.
Thank you, Whip Scalise, Ranking Member Comer. As many of you know, I began investigating the origins of COVID-19 in April last year. In October 2019, Wuhan hosted the 2019 World Military Games. These are similar to the Olympics, but with military personnel competing. October 2019, Wuhan hosted the 2019 World Military Games. These are similar to the Olympics, but with military personnel competing. More than 9,300 athletes from over 100 countries came to the city. And it should have been a massive public relations opportunity for the CCP, yet no fans or observers were allowed to attend. There were reports of roads being blocked, with athletes describing Wuhan as a ghost town. If a virus had leaked from the lab in early September, and there was an uptick in hospital visits around the old WIV, the CCP would likely be worried.
All right. Sorry, Chairman McCall. We're going to have to stop you there. So the problem with his statement there is that it's entirely speculative. So let's roll back a little bit. Let's listen to what he just said. And why did I stop him? It's because what he just said is speculative. So let me go back and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Hang on.
It's describing Wuhan as a ghost town.
Okay. Now, Wuhan may have been a ghost town because people in Wuhan were sick. Okay? That's a distinct possibility. So at the same time that these games were going on, there might have been people sick in Wuhan. Okay? Let's start with that. Now, where's he going?
The virus had leaked from the lab in early September, and there was an uptick in hospital visits around the old WIV. The CCP would likely be worried.
One more time, Chairman McCall. What was that?
As a ghost town.
Okay.
If a virus had leaked from the lab in early September, and there was an uptick in hospital visits around.
If a virus had leaked from the lab, and there was an uptick in hospital visits, so he's mixing two different things in the same sentence. So what he's saying is there was an uptick in hospital visits in Wuhan. So he's saying sort of we know that as a data point. Now he's saying if there was an escape from the lab of a virus, the CCP would be what?
On the old WIV, the CCP would likely be worried.
Yeah. I think if a bad virus were to escape from any lab in the world, the government overseeing that lab would be worried, right? So that's not a big shocker there.
This would potentially lead them back and lock down the city and ban fans from the game, which is exactly what happened.
Whoa. They banned fans from the game, or people were homesick? How do we know they banned people from the games? What is he citing here? Is he citing intelligence that we're not aware of? I didn't hear that people were banned from the games, and in the footage that I saw, the opening ceremonies, the stadium looked full. That doesn't mean the events were open to everybody, but where's that coverage? Show us that evidence, please. So this to me sounds very speculative, what he's saying. If this happened, then this, but you need to provide some evidence that these things happen. You can't just make this all based on speculation. Let's continue.
Most telling of all, dozens of these athletes have recently come forward saying they got sick while at the games with what would now be classified as COVID-like symptoms.
What would now be classified as COVID-like symptoms. Might they also be classified as influenza-like symptoms? Did they have a fever, aches, chills, night sweats? How different are those symptoms? We have this document from the Surgeon General of Canada, courtesy of Rebel News' reporting. So Rebel News broke this. And this lays out that the Canadian team came back sick. I'm going to have to read this as a bedtime story. So I'll do that this week. But this Rebel News document that they broke effectively confirms that the Canadian team came back sick and was quarantined. I've never been quarantined in my life. That's kind of a big deal. Like they do that to astronauts. So when a team comes back from an event and they're quarantined, it's a pretty big deal. Let's continue.
The village where the athletes lived was less than 8 miles from the old WIV and connected to downtown Wuhan by a new subway stop.
And he keeps saying WIV. That must be Washington, D.C. term for the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So every time you hear him say WIV, it stands for Wuhan Institute of Virology.
I now believe this was actually one of the earliest COVID-19 super spreader events.
Genius. 15 months later, Mike McCall has come to this conclusion. Fabulous, Mike. Good work. Fabulous. If you were a dog on the hunt, Mike, the fox would be dead already from old age.
At least 4 of these athletes were from countries who have now confirmed the virus was circulating within their borders in November and December of 2019. That would be Italy, Brazil, France, and Sweden.
And Canada. Let's not forget Canada. We have the document from Canada, Mike. Why are you not documenting that? Is there something about Canada you don't want to talk about, McCall? Like Winnipeg? There's only one BSL-4 laboratory in all of Canada. So in all of Trudeau's purview, there is one BSL-4 laboratory, and the Chinese award-winning virologist was kicked out by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police with her husband and her team were kicked out, and we can't get any follow-up reporting on that. And you didn't mention it, Mike, and the fact that you didn't mention it makes it even more suspicious. You just mentioned a whole bunch of countries and you didn't mention Canada, and we have the document from Rebel News. Let's go back, Mike, and listen to who you listed and who you didn't.
4 of these athletes were from countries who have now confirmed the virus was circulating within their borders in November and December of 2019. That would be Italy, Brazil, France, and Sweden. This would be the exact...
Italy, Brazil, France, Sweden, Canada, and the United States now have confirmed that their athletes came back sick. Isn't that interesting? Let's continue.
time frame that indicated it entered their borders in late October, likely from the military game athletes. I've also discovered some very important new facts. They not only point to the Wuhan Institute, being the likeliest point of origin, but they also establish a high likelihood that the virus was man-made as well.
We're going to spend a lot of time on this aspect of the story, hearing from a number of different people. Just want to let you guys watching know that the hum is coming from Congress, not from my setup. That's them. That's in the original recording. So all the humming that you're hearing is coming from Congress, and you keep hearing somebody tapping on the table. That's also not me. I don't do that. So that's all in their recording. I apologize. I tried to get rid of it, but what are you going to do? They're kind of a mess over there. That's our tax dollars at work. Continuing with Chairman McCall.
I believe we've found the answer to the question, quote, how did this virus from a cave 1,000 miles away get to the middle of a city of 11 million? It wasn't natural. It was a lab.
Ranking Member McCall mentioned the Wuhan military games. For example, I've written a letter to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs asking, have we interviewed the 284 Americans that went to those games? Were these Americans tested for antibodies? What did we learn?
284 Americans that went to the games. 284 Americans went to the Wuhan games. And what this guy wants to know is, did we test them? Have we tested them for the antibodies? Have we done cultures, nasopharyngeal cultures on them? And if not, why not? Let's go back and hear what he just said.
It was a lab.
Ranking Member McCall mentioned the Wuhan military games. For example, I've written a letter to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs asking, have we interviewed the 284 Americans that went to those games? Were these Americans tested for antibodies? What did we learn from that process? And if we haven't started that process, it can still begin. It's not too late to get more information related to this. And then fourth and finally, continuing the State Department's arms control investigation into potential biological weapons convention violations by the Chinese Communist Party. Regardless of the outcome of these investigations, and we should follow the data wherever they lead.
We owe a great deal of gratitude to you for your previous work. Dr. Giroir, thank you for the work you've been doing on this investigation, and you may begin.
All right, before we get into more of Dr. Giroir's testimony, I thought it was interesting that we had two different congressmen talking about the Wuhan Games, citing how many athletes went to the Wuhan Games. Did they bring back coronavirus? I don't know. I have a different question. Did any athletes attending the Wuhan Games bring a different virus to Wuhan? And I'm not talking about the Americans. I'm talking about the Australians. And I don't think the Australians necessarily knew what was happening. I don't think there was any kind of malicious intent. But I think the contingent from Australia, I think, was 100 people. I could be wrong, but if a handful of those were infected with something pretty bad, that's enough to start an outbreak, especially if they're in close contact and, wet showers and sneezing and coughing in dorms and stuff like that. So I'm more interested not in what did people bring home from Wuhan, but what was brought to Wuhan, because the SARS-CoV-2 thing, that coming from a lab is like, so what? I'm not as interested in SARS-CoV-2 as everybody else is. And the reason is because there's not that many people dead from it in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Vietnam. So that's why I'm not as interested in it as the influenza deaths, where I see the numbers are dramatic and I don't think people realize it's happening. So now that we've covered the Wuhan Games aspect, I wanted to go back to Dr. Giroir's testimony. He was the Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services under Trump. So Admiral Giroir held a pretty high-level position in the Trump administration and was participating in everything that was happening in 2020. So let's hear what he has to say, and we'll break it down as we go.
Ranking members Comer and Scalise, members of the House Committee and Select Subcommittee, thank you for allowing me to provide my perspectives on the origin of COVID-19. Perspective number one, although we do not yet have indisputable evidence pinpointing the exact origin of the virus that causes COVID-19, I assess that the most likely origin was an accidental infection of laboratory personnel from the Wuhan Institute of Virology with secondary transmission to the local population.
Now, I disagree with this. I disagree with this assessment. Based on what I know, based on the facts that I have, but it's speculative. So it's not really that important. So he's speculating based on the evidence that he has seen on what he thinks has happened, and I disagree with him. Okay, we'll get back to what I think happened in a little bit, but let's hear what Admiral Giroir thinks happened.
And subsequent spread to hundreds of millions of people around the world. It is essential that Congress provides leadership for a comprehensive, transparent, and unbiased investigation to determine, one, the most likely origin of the virus, two, whether the NIH funded, directly or indirectly, or approved of, explicitly or tacitly, potentially dangerous research within the Wuhan lab, and three, what the U.S. can do to minimize the possibility of future pandemics and enable rapid global containment of any suspicious infectious outbreak.
All right, so this goes back to something I think I mentioned last Friday night on the show with Jason, which is something I call Lay's syndrome. And Lay's syndrome, Lay's potato chips, I think it is saying, you can't eat just one. And I think the same is true with these virologists and gain of function and laboratories. They're not just funding one lab, one virus through something like EcoHealth. It's multiple viruses and multiple laboratories around the world and multiple researchers. So coronavirus research is just one category. There's Lassa virus, hantavirus, Marburg virus, Ebola, influenza, reconstructed pandemic influenza, which is the only BSL-4 influenza on Earth. So there's all these incredibly dangerous viruses that these guys continue to do gain-of-function type research on through mechanisms like EcoHealth or through this P3, P4 approval team committee that we heard about in the last video that we did. So there's clearly some mechanisms for it, and there were years where it was totally okay to do gain of function. And so we have to assume that in the years where gain of function was okay, they were doing plenty of it with NIH money. So let's hear more about Admiral Giroir and what he has to say to Congress.
Perspective number two. There is an increasing body of evidence pointing to a lab leak origin of the virus. One, the WHO investigation published March 1st failed to detect the presence of the virus after testing more than 80,000 wildlife, livestock, and poultry samples from 31 provinces in China. Moreover, the closest virus found in nature was...
All right, I'm not saying it came from nature. I'm saying that if it came from this lab, which it appears to have come from, apparently, if it did, I don't believe it was an accidental release. No. I think the SARS-CoV-2 virus was released on purpose. There, I said it. I think that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was released on purpose in China, in Wuhan, from that laboratory. And I think the people that released it knew full well what it was, because they had helped pay for it. Let's continue.
Quote, several decades of evolution removed from the COVID-19 virus. And we now know definitively that the Wuhan wet market was not the origin of the virus, but was a site of secondary spread.
So this is another thing that continues in disinformation and fake news channels, is this wet market thing. And the wet market was ruled out. So he just said it. It's definitive. We know definitively the wet market had nothing to do with it. So every time you hear that brought up now, that is just absolute and utter nonsense. He just said it. We know definitively the wet market had nothing to do with it. Let's go back and hear those words just one more time from him.
Virus. And we now know definitively that the Wuhan wet market was not the origin of the virus, but was a site of secondary spread. Point number 2. We know that the Wuhan lab was conducting potentially dangerous research on bat coronaviruses and their ability to cause pandemics, including gain-of-function research. This was proven in a 2015 Nature Medicine publication in which investigators from Wuhan and collaborators across the globe reported the creation of a new hybrid bat coronavirus that could bind to and infect human airway cells. Number 3, since that 2015 publication, there have been multiple NIH grants to the EcoHealth Alliance, all entitled Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence, and from the limited publicly available information, appear to be using the exact same laboratory methods that could create novel, hybrid, pandemic-causing pathogens. Number 4.
Novel pandemic-causing pathogens. Not novel pandemic-causing coronaviruses. As soon as he says pathogens, he opens it up to the whole family. And it doesn't have to be just viruses. Remember, we've talked about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a bacteria, not a virus. But it requires about a year worth of medical treatment with 4 different medicines. So if you have active tuberculosis, the treatment regimen is ruthless. A year's worth of medicine, 4 different medicines. So he's talking about pathogens now. Are they doing gain of function on tuberculosis? Why not? Let's continue.
Independent scientific studies have concluded that the first cases of COVID in China occurred sometime between mid-October and mid-November of 2019. This is the exact time frame, according to the U.S. intelligence, that some Wuhan lab workers became ill with a respiratory infection, and that, according to the Wall Street Journal, 3 Wuhan lab workers sought hospital care for an unknown respiratory illness.
An unknown respiratory illness. So we got 3 workers at the lab. They get ill with an unknown respiratory illness. About the same time as the Wuhan games are going on. Now, just because you work at the lab, I mean, you still go shopping, right? You still have to go buy food. You still run errands. You still go to the gas station, put gas in your car. So just because you work in the lab doesn't mean that you're immune to community spread of a disease that's already broken out at the Wuhan games. So might 3 people at the lab have contracted the flu? Why not? They're not immune. So we know that 3 people that work at the lab went to the hospital. The symptoms that they report are of a respiratory infection that's really kind of strange, that it sounds like they haven't seen before.
The exact time frame, according to the U.S. intelligence, that some Wuhan lab workers became ill with a respiratory infection, and that, according to the Wall Street Journal, 3 Wuhan lab workers sought hospital care for an unknown respiratory illness. And finally,
all right, now, might that unknown respiratory illness have been the same influenza that had just ravaged Australia? We know that Australia had a terrible influenza season in the summer of 2019. Their winter, our summer in the Northern Hemisphere. So June, July, August is what we refer to as summer up here to our Aussie friends. So at that time of year in 2019, Australia was going through a terrible influenza season. I think the worst in recent memory. So did those athletes from Australia bring that influenza to Wuhan? And people just start getting sick. I mean, it doesn't matter where you work. You're protected in the balloon suit while you're working on the coronavirus. But then when you go home and you go food shopping, you're not protected from the people in the supermarket that have the flu. Is that what happened? I don't know. But let's hear what Dr. Giroir thinks.
The bottom line is, I believe it is just too much of a coincidence that a worldwide pandemic caused by a novel bat coronavirus that cannot be found in nature started just a few miles away from a secretive laboratory doing potentially dangerous research on bat coronaviruses. Sometimes the most obvious explanation is indeed the correct one.
All right, so that sounds a lot like Jon Stewart. So he's saying, we got a coronavirus laboratory and a coronavirus outbreak, and why is this so hard to connect the two? So sounds a lot like the Jon Stewart bit. And again, as far as the origin of the SARS coronavirus and all that, I think David Hopkins broke the aspect of the story about the Winnipeg origins and how that could be a connection. And I felt very much the same way, agreed with him completely. That Dr. Chu in Winnipeg appears to have some connection to this. Did she first work on it in Winnipeg and then bring it to Wuhan? I think there's some likelihood that happened. So now Wuhan has the virus, and I do not think it's an accidental escape. I think that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was released potentially by Peter Daszak in order to cover up the outbreak of the H1N1 and point the fingers back to the Wuhan lab where our people knew it came from. We paid for it. The U.S. funded the research. So if we know the virus is there and we know what type of symptoms it would cause, and we have another outbreak underway, I go, hey, wait a second. If some of that got out of the lab, we could just say it was that. And then everybody gets angry at Peter Daszak. He's not even an American, let alone he doesn't work for the American government. And blame it on him. Is that what happened? I don't know. Let's listen to Admiral Giroir, see what he thinks.
Objective number 3. The WHO cannot be relied upon to do an authoritative investigation because it is a multilateral organization with no authority to do anything in China that is not directly approved by the Chinese Communist Party. On behalf of the Trump administration in September 2020, I delivered a comprehensive roadmap of reform to the executive board of the WHO that would strengthen the WHO's global emergency preparedness and response capabilities. This roadmap would better equip the WHO for future pandemics, but by the WHO's very nature as a multilateral organization, it can never be relied on to guarantee transparency from repressive regimes, nor assure the health and safety of the American public. Finally, with regard to
those are pretty strong words. I don't know, has he seen the influenza reporting coming out of the WHO? Because those are pretty strong words coming from him. One more time, what did he just say? I mean, that was biting.
WHO's very nature as a multilateral organization, it can never be relied on to guarantee transparency from repressive regimes, nor assure the health and safety of the American public. Finally, with regard to the WHO, when this pandemic first emerged in China and began spreading around the world, the only eligible nation that did not have a member on the WHO executive board was the United States. That is because after I was nominated for the executive board by President Trump in November 2018, my nomination was repeatedly blocked by Senator Schumer and his Democrat colleagues, and I was not confirmed, and thus the U.S. did not have visibility at the executive board level until May of 2020.
So because Admiral Giroir's confirmation was blocked by Senator Schumer, he didn't participate at the executive level in the WHO. And the United States didn't have representation. So that's the butterfly effect, Senator Schumer, that the downstream ramifications of your actions had implications on the global stage that you never foresaw. Let's continue.
Perspective number 4, the final one. The investigation of the origins of COVID-19 and the regulation of gain-of-function research cannot be left to scientists alone, many of whom have serious conflicts of interest. These conflicts include hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual salary, pharmaceutical company paid advisory board seats, millions of dollars in grants, rights to inventions that could result in tens of millions of dollars in royalties, and perhaps most important, their reputations among an often elitist scientific community that is overwhelmingly biased against anything related to the Trump administration. Similarly, Americans should be careful of defenses of China by experts who are employed by or on the boards of companies with billions of dollars at stake in China and who fear reprisals from the Chinese Communist Party. In conclusion, it is critical to our nation, to the American people, to the world, and to future generations that we develop a bipartisan consensus on the truth of what happened. And I respectfully encourage the entire Congress to come together as truth seekers and truth tellers to accomplish this objective. Thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Next is Dr. Stephen Quay. He's a physician and a scientist with hundreds of published scientific articles. Dr. Quay has been cited over 10,000 times, holds 87 patents across 22 different fields of medicine, and he's invented 7 different FDA-approved medicines. Further, he conducted an early analysis of COVID-19, which has been downloaded nearly 200,000 times. He's an expert in the field and brings an upper echelon of analysis to the question we're posing today about the origins. Now to you, Dr. Quay.
Thank you, Congressman Scalise and Comer, members of the subcommittee of the coronavirus crisis, ladies and gentlemen. As inconvenient as it is, I believe the evidence conclusively establishes that the COVID pandemic was not a natural process, but instead came from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, and that it has the fingerprints of genetic manipulation through a process called gain-of-function research. There are 6 undisputed facts that support this hypothesis. Now, as a reminder, the top left there, a little science. As a reminder, all zoonoses are diseases that involve a virus infecting an animal, the animal coming in contact with a human, and then the human being infected. The question of the origin of a zoonosis is the question of the location of the animal. In natural zoonoses, the animal is in nature, a cave, a farm, or the market. The infected human comes in contact with the animal and gets sick. For lab-acquired zoonoses, the animal is in a laboratory or in cells from an animal in a petri dish, and the human works in that lab. In deciding between a natural origin and the lab origin, there are 6 facts no one disagrees with. Number 1, the Chinese first told the world that the COVID pandemic began in the Hunan seafood market because approximately 1/2 of the early cases had been associated with that location. This would have been reminiscent of the 2 previous coronavirus epidemics, as both SARS-1 and MERS began in live animal markets. However, after 18 months of investigation, we now know it did not begin in a market in Wuhan for the following 3 reasons. First, none of the 11 patients from the Hunan market or any other market in Wuhan were infected with the earliest virus, meaning they came into the market already infected. The 4 patients with the earliest genetic version of the virus all had one thing in common. None had any exposure to the Hunan market. Second, we know in January 2020 from public scientific databases that the patient with the earliest first complete virus sequence was a 39-year-old man treated at the General Hospital of Central Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army of China, located on Wuho Road in the Wuchang district of Wuhan, about 3 kilometers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. After 18 months and almost 3 million viruses sequenced worldwide, this virus still remains the earliest. Second, none of the environmental specimens from the market had the earliest virus, meaning they also came into the market. This included 1,055 samples of frozen food in the market, all of which tested negative for COVID. Third, 457 animals from Hunan market were tested. All were negative for COVID. 616 animals from suppliers to the market were tested. All were negative. 1,864 wild animals from southern China of the type found in the market were tested. They were also all negative. These data from the publicly available WHO report established that it did not begin in the Hunan market or any other market in Wuhan. Number two, failing to find it in any market in Wuhan, the search was expanded to all of China. But after testing 80,000 samples from 209 different species from other markets, farms, and nature, the virus has not been found in a single specimen. The probability.
All right, so this reminds me of looking for MH370 west of Australia in the southern Indian Ocean. It's like they're looking at all these animals, and they're testing seafood, and they're testing this, and they're looking for the coronavirus, and did it come from the fish, or did it come from the turtle? What the hell difference does it make? People are dying from influenza. If people were dying from reconstructed pandemic influenza, what difference does it make where the SARS-CoV-2 came from? So again, we get back to the heart of the matter from my perspective, which is if there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing and there aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, and there still aren't 100 dead in Vietnam, how deadly is SARS-CoV-2 in and of itself? I'm not talking about all the comorbidity stuff. I understand that. But SARS-CoV-2 itself, just on the death certificates, SARS-CoV-2 itself alone accounts for 5% of the roughly 600,000 deaths. Just 5%. That's less than 30,000 people right now in the United States that have died with just SARS-CoV-2. And if there aren't 10 in Beijing and there aren't 10 in Shanghai, and there's not 100 in Vietnam, why are they obsessing about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and not the influenza that everybody appears to have stopped reporting on?
The probability of this for a community-acquired infection is about 1 in a million. This is what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. Number three, after testing 9,952 stored human blood specimens from hospitals in Wuhan from before December 29th, there was not a single case of COVID in any specimen. It was expected that between 100 and 400 would be positive. The probability of this for a community-acquired infection is also about 1 in a million. But this is what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. There is no evidence of multiple animal-to-human transmissions. With 2 prior coronavirus outbreaks, SARS-1 and MERS, 50 to 90% of early cases were from various animal-to-human infections. For SARS-CoV-2, 249 early cases of COVID-19 were examined genetically, and they all were human-to-human transmission. For a community-acquired infection, this is the probability of tossing a coin 249 times and getting heads every single time. This is, however, what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. Number 5, SARS-CoV-2 has a unique trigger on its surface called a furin cleavage site and a unique code in the genes for that site called a CGG dimer.
Ta-da! Now, I know Dan Bongino was talking about this, so tip of the hat to Dan. He brought this up, the CGG. So this is, again, there's a lot of information here. This is a multi-hour testimony, and this is kind of key. So again, tip of the hat to Dan for finding this, or whoever pointed it out to Dan Bongino. Let's listen again to what this doctor says about the CGG, because it's a very specific part.
249 times and getting heads every single time. This is, however, what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. Number 5, SARS-CoV-2 has a unique trigger on its surface called a furin cleavage site and a unique code in the genes for that site called a CGG-CGG dimer. So these are two independent levels of uniqueness. The furin site is why the virus is so transmissible, why it invades the heart, the brain, and the blood vessels. Viruses like Ebola, HIV, Zika, yellow fever all use furin sites, and this is part of the reason for their deadliness. But the entire group of coronaviruses in which SARS-CoV-2 belongs does not contain a single example of a furin site or a single example of the CGG-CGG dimer code.
Huh. So isn't that interesting? So what he's saying is none of the other coronaviruses have this. But Ebola does. Did you hear that? Okay, let's go back. Ebola has it. Remember I told you Dr. Chu and her Ebola research was going to play a role. Here we go.
Transmissible, why it invades the heart, the brain, and the blood vessels. Viruses like Ebola, HIV, Zika, yellow fever all use furin sites, and this is part of the reason for their deadliness.
Furin sites. Furin sites. So Ebola uses furin sites. No other coronavirus has furin sites other than SARS-CoV-2. Huh. That's according to this guy, not according to me. I don't give advice. I don't make any claims. I'm just sharing my understanding of what he just said. Okay, and he's like a big shot testifying to Congress. So testing my understanding is that Ebola has these things. No other coronavirus has them other than SARS-CoV-2.
But the entire group of coronaviruses in which SARS-CoV-2 belongs does not contain a single example of a furin site or a single example of the CGG-CGG dimer code. A comprehensive...
All right, so the CGG-CGG dimer code related to the furin sites. Okay, we're a little bit out of my world here, but it makes sense, right? So he's describing it. He's saying it exists in Ebola, HIV, these other deadly diseases, Zika virus, doesn't exist in any other coronavirus other than this one. That's my understanding. I could be wrong.
By MIT group shows that there has never been a furin site or the CGG letter dimer in this group of coronaviruses for at least 1,000 years, since William won the Battle of Hastings in 1066 to become monarch of England. But since 1992, in gain-of-function experiments, the WIV and other laboratories around the world have inserted furin sites into viruses repeatedly. It is the only sure method that always works and always makes them more infectious. And the CGG-CGG code found in COVID-19 is commonly used in laboratories around the world, including the WIV. You can literally order it from a supply company on the internet. By the way, some virologists have said, well, but Dr. Quay, furin sites and codon dimers occur in one or more other of the 4 classes of coronaviruses, and with a process called recombination, a COVID-like virus could pick one up. This is wrong for 3 reasons based on well-known fundamental biology, probably college level. Because coronaviruses do exchange genetic material so easily, the very existence and stability of these 5 distinct groups is evidence from nature that there must be barriers for exchange of genetic material. I've spoken previously about the 1,000-year stability of the group of COVID that COVID belongs to. If recombination was easy, this group would have merged into the other 4 into a single group. 2 things stop recombination from happening. And this includes research by Dr. Dasick and Shi, by the way. First, recombination happens when one poor bat is infected with 2 different viruses, and during that co-infection, the genetic material gets exchanged. So,
One poor bat is infected by 2 viruses at the same time. And it sounds like those 2 viruses create a some sort of a hybrid virus. Is that my understanding here? Let's hear this again.
During that co-infection, the genetic material gets exchanged. So here, the group of viruses that have furin sites and CGG dimers don't infect the same bat species as the COVID-like viruses that don't have furin sites. So the COVID viruses can only exchange genetic
To be honest, he just lost me on that, and I'm not going to dig in. Let's just see where he goes. I think he's almost done. We're going to go to the next person.
material within their group, the group that hasn't had a furin site or a CGG dimer for 1,000 years. Now, second, even if you force two different viruses into a cell in the laboratory, there are unique genetic sequences that are required for gene combination or recombination to occur. The hotspots where exchange can occur are different for each group and incompatible between the groups. In a clever use of this concept, Dr. Ralph Barrick, a leading coronavirus scientist from North Carolina, once made a vaccine candidate that was resistant to recombination. He didn't want it to recombine after he put it out in the world. He did this by using synthetic biology to change the hotspot gene sequences.
Dr. Quay has covered most of the science that is most relevant. I would like to emphasize 5 points, each of which is capable of separating and distinguishing between a natural origin, a zoonotic origin, and the lab origin. So let me just draw your attention to these 5. The first one is the absence of a pre-pandemic infections. He mentioned that. And with not over 9,000 samples taken in Wuhan, no pre-pandemic infections, that's unprecedented. That didn't happen with MERS, didn't happen with SARS, doesn't happen with other viruses. Unprecedented. It's very difficult to explain.
No, it's not really that difficult to explain as long as you guys are only looking for one particular virus. You're not pulling your lens back far enough. You're saying there's no other patients earlier than such and such a time with this, and it doesn't just show up overnight, and I understand that, but you're only looking for one thing. You're assuming everybody's infected with the exact same affliction, and you're not pulling the lens back enough to understand there could be 2 viruses. And in fact, the SARS-CoV-2 is probably the least of Wuhan's problems in the October, November, December timeframe. SARS-CoV-2 doesn't end up killing 10 people in Beijing. It doesn't end up killing 10 people in Shanghai, and has still yet to kill 100 in Vietnam. So it's the influenza. So he's kind of baffled because a single virus would never behave like this, and that's right. That's right. But if there's a second virus, that would explain a lot, wouldn't it? Let's go back and hear what he just said, because he's somewhat baffled by this.
Pandemic infections, that's unprecedented. That didn't happen with MERS, didn't happen with SARS, doesn't happen with other viruses. Unprecedented. It's very difficult to explain. Papers are being written trying to explain it, but those papers aren't evidence. They're what you do when you're stuck and the evidence disagrees with you. The absence of a host animal. If you look at the famous Lancet article, one of the reasons they say you can dismiss these conspiracy theories of lab origin is because they explicitly say China has identified the host animal. They've identified the location, and they even praise China for its openness. This paper, The Lancet, does not read well when we look at it 16 months later. I recommend everybody reread it and see whether there's any value in that. The unprecedented genetic purity that Dr. Quay talked about. Again, MERS, SARS, previous viruses don't have this, but it is exactly what you would expect if you've gone through gain of function. So each one of these things is compelling. By itself, if we had any one of the 5 things, these are 3 of them, we should conclude that the evidence strongly favors the lab origin. The spike mutation. The fact that there's no known way for that spike mutation to get there other than by gene insertion in a laboratory is a very powerful argument. And And again, there are papers written that try to explain this away, but those papers aren't presenting evidence. The evidence in favor of the natural zoonotic origin, there isn't any. The only evidence that's cited is, well, it looks like another zoonotic case, or those cases are quite common, but there's no scientific evidence supporting those. And finally, the fact that this virus was optimized to attack humans. Again, something that has never happened in other in natural releases.
Optimized to attack humans. What the heck is that all about? What is he talking about here? Let's dig into this.
But it does happen if you run it through the gain of function. So there's really all of the scientific evidence argues in favor of the laboratory origin.
There we have it.
To Mr. Jordan for a second round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just, for the record, if we could just run down the line here. Each of you believe that the virus started in the lab in Wuhan, China.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. And each of you believe that, by definition, if it starts in the lab, it's man-made, it's engineered.
Not correct.
Okay.
It's very unlikely this was found in nature, but there is a scenario that it could have been collected in nature and then brought to a population center of 11 million, which is kind of crazy, and then accidentally leaked. It could also have been, when you say man-made, it could have been naturally evolved, which is what was suggested earlier. So it wasn't like humans putting pieces together, but allow the virus to do the virus.
Which do you think is more likely, the humans engineering it or what you just described?
I think more likely is this was, and again, this is speculation, but I think more likely it was evolved by passage either in human cells or by, quote, humanized mice to have a very virulent pathogen, at least the majority of which, and
Okay.
but it's still the same thing. Okay, what?
Now, Admiral Gerard just talked about humanized mice and growing in humanized mice, and I think Dr. Judy got a wrath of aggravation and harassment over that, and he just talked about it. So I think Dr. Judy's owed quite a few apologies at this point. Let's continue.
I used a genetic tool, or whether I evolved it in nature, or maybe did a little bit of both, as might have been suggested. It's still a lab.
Either one of those routes is still considered gain-of-function research.
Yes. Well, yes. If you're passaging it to gain
Right.
of function, yes.
'Cause it's
Or
getting
you're
more lethal.
engineering it to gain of function.
Okay.
That's gain of
Just want to
function.
make sure we're all on the same page. And
Do we get to answers?
yeah, I saw head shakes from everyone, so
Yeah.
I'm thinking that on the first part. Yeah. Mueller?
Yeah, I would say that that the evidence that this was created by manipulation, by gene splicing, as well as gain of function, is compelling and beyond reasonable doubt. The scientific evidence is very strong, remarkably strong,
So
stronger than anything
Do you think
I
it's engineered?
engineered.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, I have been involved in many scientific discoveries, and I have never seen such compelling evidence, even for those scientific
Okay,
discoveries
that's
in,
where I was at.
in
Fine.
physics.
All right, Dr. Asher.
The key thing is to ask as you move toward declassification of information that needs to be seen, protecting the sources and methods, just ask how much intelligence there is on it coming out of nature.
Right.
You'll be interested in that answer.
Yeah, I think we know that. Almost rhetorical, right? If we had known it was from the lab, and as Dr. Mueller points out, engineered, I think you said earlier, Dr. Gerard, that would have helped us save lives. Is that true?
I do believe that. Two answers, whether it was engineered or not, if we would have known early and there wasn't a cover-up, we could have saved lives. Number two, if we knew it was lab-derived and they were transparent, again, I'm just hearing about the ORF7 interferon right here, but that is such a key issue,
Yeah.
which tells you if you get fever and get sick because of your interferon response, and if it was deliberately engineered, to block that, not only does that become more infectious, but it means you're going to be asymptomatic.
Yeah.
Now, the interferon response is something that Dr. Roger Schwelt talked about and Dr. Judy spoke about on the show. So I did a show with Dr. Roger Schwelt, and I did a couple shows with Dr. Judy, and this came up in the show. So let's continue.
Could have been a major, major, important finding for us to know early if that were true.
Dr. Quay, do you believe if we'd have known early, we'd have saved lives?
Yes, again, as I said earlier, if I had the virus in 72 hours, I could have predicted all of the transmission and asymptomatic from the virus itself. So,
Dr. Mueller, if we'd have known early that this was from a lab and an engineered virus, do you think that would have helped to save lives?
I have no scientific expertise on this. I have my own personal opinion, but I defer to Dr. Quay on such issues.
Okay, Dr. Asher?
Key question, I think, is did we actually know and not process the data? And that's something we can fix. It's not that we can't expect the intel fairy to exist on the policymaker's desk and say, oh, what do you want to know today? But certainly at State Department, we would have liked to have known that the Chinese were working on the types of research we later learned they were, and that maybe was in the possession of our government while this was happening.
Well,
so we might have known, but didn't actually know. You understand? It's a weird thing, like with pre-9/11 information.
Well, I'm going to take it a little broader, but you're sort of getting to the point I wanted to make is Dr. Fauci was on notice on February 1st. Actually, take that back. He was on notice on January 31st. We got the email where one of the scientists who gets American tax dollars sent him the email and says, the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, so one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features look engineered. I think the assumption for most of us has been it's a leak from the lab, but you're the one who raised the bioweapon. You brought up that term, and you've been at the State Department. I think you were at the State Department for over 25 years.
In and out.
In and out, educated at Oxford and Cornell. You know a little something about all this stuff. Tell me your answer to, was it just a lab leak or was it a bioweapon?
They were working on a program related to synthetic biology and gain of function using the serial passage evolutionary or convolutionary technology approaches. Quite publicly, actually, that they had said in their 2011 Declaration of the Biological Weapons Convention and other places, including speeches by their generals, was related to their future of warfare, of hybrid warfare. So, of course, they were working on dual-use research of concern. It's called DIRC. And the DIRC, in this case, again, if it gets out of a lab and it's not contained promptly, could result in a weapons-like release. Okay, whether they deliberately did it is, I have very little sense they did. But were they deliberately working on developing the capability to use advanced pathogenetic capabilities of war in a way that no one's seen ever employed? Yeah, they were. Of course they are. That's what the Chinese have been talking about publicly. So, I mean, there shouldn't be any surprise here. I just don't know why no one paid attention to it.
So, Dr. Asher talked about export controls for biotechnology, and I know he knows this as well or better than I do. But it's not just technology, but it's information, and our genetic information is actually critical. And I do assess that the Chinese have set up circumstances that they're doing a lot of our gene sequencing of Americans that are through normal labs or even through studies at the NIH. And they're doing that for a reason, and that genetic sequences are powerful. They know our vulnerabilities. It is the first step in devising a potentially ethnic weapon, as was discussed by Dr. Asher. And similarly, I don't know if it's still the case, but I believe it is, you're not going to see any genetic sequences of Chinese exported out of the country. That was a law. There's a reason for that. And when we talk about export of technology, export of our genetic information may be the most important key that we need to stop.
Well, I want to make sure I understand this. So American genetic information is going to China. The same China that Dr. Asher talked about is doing bioweapon research with this stuff. And you're saying that combination is of particular concern.
Oh, it is an absolutely huge concern from where I sit. And again, I've been out of the formal bioweapons defense, part of the government for a period of time. But genetic information, is very powerful, right? It decides who we are. It tells about our vulnerabilities, not only disease states, but potential for genetic weapons. And what I mean by that is there are variations in receptors and other things that vary by populations, and those can potentially be exploited so that a new pathogen would differentially target a race, a European ancestry versus someone else. And we are essentially just giving all that information to China in the context of what I do believe is an unprecedented and
What's
terrifying.
the rationale for giving that to China? I mean,
Well,
I think that's a
because
fundamental question we got to ask on all this. Why are we giving all this information to China?
Because most people in the community are either naive to the threat, they deny the threat, they're oblivious to the threat, or just don't want to think about it. And that's my assessment of many of the people involved in research. It's not that they're evil, it's not they're giving it to them, but they don't just understand what is happening in China and other places.
Wow.
And we're providing this in a naive fashion across the board. And I just wanted to point out that genetic information, and again, I hope Dr. Dasher would agree with this, but genetic information is one of those things that, we should be keeping as a vital national security secret, and not providing it to adversary nations who wish to develop weapons, even openly in the literature.
I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Hypothetically Speaking. I'm John Cohen. Thanks for joining.